Kia ora tātou, welcome back to another episode of the Happy Revolution podcast. In this episode, myself and special guest host Dr Michaela Richards chat with Emeritus Professor of Religion Dr Paul Morris. I often begin an interview by apologising for the poor sound quality, but this one is by far the worst, with Dr Morris's voice being quite faint. But also as he speaks, he emphasises his point by kind of banging on the table, which really distorted the audio throughout the interview. So whenever you hear that sound, you can just think of Paul Morris emphasising his point as he speaks. Because of these issues, this episode might take a brave sort of person to venture into, but it is well worth the effort. It was by far one of my favourite conversations. Michaela, Paul and I chat about religious literacy, religious diversity, secular privilege, and the state of religious studies both globally and in Aotearoa New Zealand. This was just a brilliant tidal wave of a conversation and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. Many thanks to both Paul Morris and Michaela Richards for joining. Thanks again to all involved, and a special thanks to Toby Sussex for his sound work on this episode. We hope you enjoy. I don't think there's anything more to say except we can just get into it.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. Michaela's first time as well, so welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. We wanted to just start with asking you if you could introduce yourself to us and tell us what your area of expertise is and who you are.
I can.
Yeah.
I'm Paul Morris, and I taught at Victoria for 25 years, which makes me very old. But my exposure to religious studies began at Victoria. I began as a student in 73, 74, and that's how old I am. And I was enrolled as a law student for legal system. And I was such a well-informed young person, I didn't realise you had to take other subjects. And so I had to, in those days, people used to queue up outside the Hunter building to register in person.
Oh.
It was about a fifth of the size the university is now. And so I didn't want to lose my place in the queue. And I had a copy of the calendar. And so I picked subjects in the queue. And I did philosophy, and I signed up to do philosophy and sociology. And when I got there, I thought that was enough, but the woman said you need a third art subject. So I chose religious studies. And so in that way, I didn't have a very strong commitment to religious studies. And my reason for doing it was I grew up in a Jewish family, and religious studies has always been very Christian. And all I knew about Lloyd Gearing was that he was a preacher, etc., etc. But I did do a course and enjoyed it immensely, and partly because the world had changed. And other things now serve the function that religious studies did, or Lloyd's introduction, which began with the Bible and took you through to the contemporary world. And so in 12 weeks, you were completely empowered. I thought I understood the Western tradition, Christianity, theology, everything. And that was actually misleading. Whereas philosophy, which I was much more interested in initially, but I thought it was a kind of, the big theories. But of course, this was the 1970s, and so we didn't do ethics. We did introduction to metaethics, the language of ethics. And the philosophy was a kind of logical positivism. We looked at the way words functioned, and we looked at but metaphysics was a way of talking rather than about the world. And so even though I did philosophy in the subsequent years, it was much more narrow focus. And in a way, Lloyd's introduction, and I then decided to do a second religious studies paper, which was a ridiculous introduction to the East, again in 12 weeks. The person doing it didn't have Lloyd's synoptic vision. And so I really enjoyed it very, very much. And so much so that the following year I decided not to continue law and did religious studies and philosophy. So it had a huge impact. My mother never quite forgave me. And there are quite a few lawyers in our extended family. Anyway, so and I finished my BA, and there was no honours in those days in religious studies, so it was difficult to you went on to an MA, much like some people do now. And so I decided to apply for a scholarship, and I was very, very struck by a particular program which came out of a Christian Studies program, a Religious Studies program, which was in Canada at McMaster University, which at the time was the leading religious studies program in Canada. And although I'd not been to Canada, but off we went to Canada, which is a very good thing to do. And I studied with Phyllis Granoff, who is just retired from Yale, who is a truly phenomenal linguist as well as a natural philosopher, who did a whole series of pioneering work on India and Japan. I mean, she's pretty amazing. So I studied and did an MA there, and did 2 years of Sanskrit, and did a very funny course, because I did half Jewish studies and half Indian studies, so it didn't fit very well. So I had Alan Cooper and Eugene Coombs, two famous Old Testament scholars, and was so studying Hebrew Bible and the history of interpretation, but also looking at Indian materials. And when it came to my thesis, I did a translation and commentary of the Aotearoa Bhasha, a particular text attributed, actually probably written by Shankaracharya, the great Advaitin Vedanta. But I was a very young man and very naive, and the piece I chose, the Aotearoa Bhasha, was the introduction to his Brahma Sutra Bhasha, his commentary on a bigger text. And it's all very, very attractive to men in their early 20s. The world is a dream. And I was utterly besotted by the idea that somehow reality was very, very different in a very naive, silly way. But I enjoyed it immensely. And what I gained was something quite significant, was simply that the value of religious studies was radically alternative ways of thinking about the world. Something which that people will always moan about the past, but something which is much less evidently so now. And we should come back to that, because I think it may be worth discussing. So I wanted to have a broader understanding of religious studies, and I read several works by a man called Ninian Smart, who was the great doyen of religious studies. So I left after my MA and applied for 3 different graduate places to do a PhD, all in the UK, which I was very keen to do, and to using them for a common scholarship. And I got 3 places and was interviewed by 3 places. I got a place at Oxford to study with a Jainist, with a very particular narrow Sanskrit scholar, a place at SOAS to study with Tuvia Gelnbaum, who's my interview with him was absolutely disastrous. I was really surprised. Well, he started off by saying, I've interrupted my holiday in Italy I was told by the university that you'd applied and you had a scholarship and I had to come and interview you. So I felt really guilty. And I thought it had gone very wrong. I just kept apologizing because Italian Riviera holiday has been spoiled. The upshot of it was I was older. But then I went up to Lancaster, which was, I was keen to study with Ninian, but wanted to explore these things. And we had the interview at his house with his tennis court in Lancaster, and drank gins and tonics. And I met some of the staff who were there, someone who was in charge of the graduate program, etc. And he was just was wonderfully friendly and nice. So I decided, well, that sounds okay. Yeah. So moving to the northwest of England was a strange decision. That's much more alien than Canada. Much more alien. But it was quite a good choice in some way. And I for 4 years altogether, but 3 years and then another year, I studied with Ninian, and I learned a lot about phenomenology and a lot about, I became a phenomenologist of religion and imbibed deeply at the Ninian Smart well. And it was, he had a vision for religious studies, which was just that religion was a challenge and significant for contemporary thinking. And also introduced me to religious studies in schools in Britain, which he was principal agent of the transfer from Christian studies, which was called religious education, to religious studies in schools. And so I had a really good time doing my doctorate. My doctorate was on the challenges of modern thought, traditional thought, which kind of worked well, although done in much too. I wouldn't have let me be as broad as I was, but never mind that. But Ninian was a perfect and dreadful supervisor. The first time I gave him work, I'd written the introductory chapter, and it was sent back to me because he was always, there used to be a joke, Ninian's not here, Ninian's elsewhere. But he did travel a lot. And I had one red tick on my 60 pages.
Wow.
Which I'd spent hours. And when I met him, I said, he said, it's fine. So, but I don't know. He was a less engaged supervisor than I've been in that. But I did learn a great deal from him. And someone left from the department, and I was incredibly honoured to be offered a position at Lancaster, which in its time was the leading religious studies department. So it was very hard to turn it down. And so accidentally I spent another 10 years in Lancaster.
Accidentally.
Well, no, I mean, it wasn't our plan. And but it was fine. And so, and religious studies there, the department at it was 16 full-time academics and part-timers. And so it was on a scale that was very different from both the Canadian experience, but my undergraduate experience too. And it was, the lovely thing was that people were amazingly specialised. And the degree was, when I started there, a single major degree. So you basically did 3 years of study in religious studies. And there were a whole range of compulsory courses. And most people did a language that was associated with their study. There was a free ninth paper, which was you had a final 3-hour exam just with one question, which was measured. So it was,
That sounds horrible.
That sounds awful.
Well, I tried to introduce it when I came back here, but
Well, I'm glad that didn't go through.
It's incredibly revealing. So there were questions like, you have to be religious to understand religious studies, and you've got 3 hours to answer. And people really drew heavily on what they'd learned. You couldn't prepare for them very easily. Anyway, so I think I learned quite a lot, and I enjoyed the time there. And it was a productive time in terms of research, and it was, and I was a founder member of the Centre for Cultural Studies there, which is where the questions of religious input into contemporary debates and issues. And I worked on a series of projects there that focused on community, religious understandings of community, and the way these differ from modern constructionist notion of Gesellschaft of communities of shared interest. And I wrote about that. We also looked at religion and economy. And so I was very interested in thinking about different ways of thinking about the market. Religion's got deeply entangled with market economics and neoliberalism in ways which, 30 years ago we were challenging, a battle we lost, but an important one. And so, anyway, I was very, very happy there and got promoted there. And then somebody wrote to me from Vic and said there was a position at Vic. And so I had strange reasons I wasn't all that keen, but I had strange reasons for wanting to come, which was my parents were on the North Shore in Auckland, and I thought coming out for an interview was a very good trip to go and see my parents. So I did. And there were 2 other people, and I was interviewed, and kind of very long story short, I was offered a position, and I took it for 3 years and a secondment in case I wanted to go back. And it was very exciting there, and an awful lot happening in a way that when I took over the department, there was Jim Veach and several part-timers, and so it was a tiny venture. But in some ways that was fun because you got to remake it yourself, and the things that I'd learned could be applied, but also to do it rather differently.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's my background, and then 25 years just slipped away. But I kept going a kind of interest in the way the modern world meets traditions, but also did some work in Jewish studies, and of course, some work on religion in New Zealand, because this is where I was, and knew less and less about as time went on, but it was an area that was very understudied, and still is in a serious way.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the introduction.
Cool, amazing. I've got a few comments more than questions. Firstly, the narrative of how you got into religious studies, I had no idea about that, and I think that's so cool. That's how I got into religious studies as well. And I think having tutored and taught the past 5 years, that's the narrative that keeps coming through. Someone comes in like, I'm just doing this as an interest paper, and then we hook them and they're here doing it as a major going on. So yeah, that's very promising. We can all be Paul Morris one day is what I'm hearing. Also the fact that Ninian Smart was your supervisor, that's like celebrity.
I did not know that. That's very cool.
Okay, well, he was undoubtedly a celebrity, but that had its good, that was a wonderfully mixed blessing. But he did create opportunities. I got to teach in Santa Barbara because he had a joint appointment between Lancaster and Santa Barbara, and so that was a really good opportunity. He was a wonderful referee for getting funding.
True.
And things. So, no, seriously. And what he built at Lancaster, I mean, is still going in the religious studies has, and that's one question you should ask me later, how religious studies has changed, because it's been dramatic. And again, pluses and minuses. But what he built, I mean, kind of worked. And was a very interesting and eclectic group of people that I came in time to join. It was exciting intellectually.
Because we just tutored Rally 108 World's Religions together, and we still draw on Ninian Smart's directions very heavily. So.
He died a few years ago.
Oh, did he?
Of cirrhosis of the liver. He alcohol.
The gin and tonics by the tennis court.
Whiskey and
Yes. That was hammered in first year. The 7 dimensions. The 7 dimensions.
Smart. So
yeah.
Well, when I first read that, as a student here, it was it was a framework for thinking about it and a method. I'm much more critical of both of them. But it was it was really good to more than the books, to spend time listening to him and learning.
Definitely,
It's amazing.
That's amazing.
Well, there's so many things we could talk about. It's really hard to know where to go. But we, in trying to write these questions, we decided to go in the direction of talking about secularism, talking about religious diversity and religious literacy.
Yeah, come back to the history of religious studies if we get a chance.
I'd also love to ask, we can ask this later on, but you mentioned Ninian Smart's vision for religious studies. And I'd love to know your vision for religious studies as well. So
I'm very interested in that.
Maybe we'll talk about that. But for now, do you want to ask the next question about secularism?
So, is Aotearoa a secular country? Would you determine that it's a secular country?
It's kind of meaningless without some metric of agency. The country doesn't exist like that. I mean, that's an amazing abstraction. The team of 5 million is now a team of perhaps 5.3 million. But I'm struck again and again by both the uniformity and the sheer diversity of Aotearoa, and both coexist. Because we have a horrible ideological conformity, but actually linguistic, cultural, religious, ethnic and racial diversity, and that's constantly contested. So the issue of secularism, my way of thinking about it is that unless you know, what agency you're playing, if you talk about the country, it's meaningless. The country doesn't, isn't anything but an amalgamation. If you talk about the government, we don't have a single government in quite that way, but a series of overlapping agencies. But in a way, the only helpful way that I think about that question, which I don't think is a significant question, unless you have an ideology. If you want to create a space for religion, then it's quite good in secularism. But it's a strategy rather than anything you can actually measure or study. But Christian privilege is where I start from, which is simply that if we go back to 1961, the census, I mean, you're looking at 95% plus of the population. Very absolutely 90% of the population is Pākehā, 7% is Māori, 3% are other, and something like 96% are Christian. And so to talk about a Christian heritage, and we need now to talk about how it unraveled within 3 decades. I mean, it's not only a New Zealand story, but there is a New Zealand version and iteration of the story that's significant. So the legacy of Christian privilege it hasn't been very well studied. I mean, it's been contested since the 1877 Education Act. It's constantly been challenged. And as New Zealand threw up a kind of Christian establishment, it had anti-Christian figures, and some of whom were Christian, but the establishment was what they opposed. And there's a whole complex, I've read about political history of that unfolding. And it unfolds in different spheres. I mean, in religious education, in parliamentary process, in the influence of the religion, of religions, of churches largely, almost exclusively, on politics. So for a thing I did for the Labour Party, I looked at the 1935 manifesto. And it's amazing that the Catholic Church, on the official Labour Party 1935 manifesto, and the Anglican Church and the Methodists and the Presbyterians all bought advertising space. So the tradition is of the churches having a role to play. They weren't the only voices, and they generated a minority anti-church voice, a humanist and rationalist voice, etc., etc. I co-supervised Bill Cook's thesis on the rationalists and humanists of New Zealand, and he's highlighted these alternative voices. But in things like religious education, more than 4/5 of students did the Bible in Schools program. And so even though nothing was official and it lived in a slightly grey area, Christian privilege was evident, and evident in the church leaders' meetings in the 50s and 60s with government. And so at local and national levels, the Christian privilege was evident, and it was a default position. Blasphemy was in the Crimes Act. It's not there thanks to Andrew Little, but it was. There were a series of moral guidelines which reflected a broad Christian ethic. And so in many ways it just was the default position. The challenge of the breakdown, and these are parallel stories, of how you get from 1961 and this Christian domination to, I don't know, the last census, the first figures are just coming out, but the 2018, the last official census, where Christian figures are 37.2%, where over 50% have no religion. And there have been incredibly dramatic changes. And I don't think we fully understand those changes. They were partly the 60s rebellion against authority, which happened in the 70s here. They were partly to do with migration patterns. They were partly to do with, paradoxically, the 1964 Education Act after the 62 report, which actually created a real place for Bible in schools, only for it to be a choice that increasingly was rejected. Plus a demographic shift of people who were increasingly didn't go to church, didn't have a Christian formation, and without it being replaced by anything. And these were statistically the better educated among New Zealanders who found their way into the professions, into Parliament, into the civil service, etc., etc. And so there was a kind of, it wasn't so much a secularizing in a Charles Taylor sense. It wasn't a secularizing. It was just in that broader and older sense. Turner gives the best framing for this, Brian Turner, which is simply that the institutional life of the church had less and less significance. De-differentiation, they're technical words for this. But and so in that way, the country lost its Christian religion without a debate, really. And clergy scandals helped in all sorts of ways. But the upshot of it was a kind of implicit secular privilege, which just assumed unless you had a special reason, religion was a place you didn't want to go. And so religion just got sidelined in terms of education. And every time it was raised, in 2006, I was involved in the campaign to do religious studies in the schools. And we got through most of the barriers, but at the last minute, there was a conservative Christian backlash, and Trevor, the then Minister of Education, got cold feet, and they backed off from it. And it still turns out to be decisive, and partly it's because the church has never had the debate. And so when asked why wouldn't you support Christianity if the alternative was, an anti-Christian point of view? But it was more likely just neglect. So in some ways, we've had a kind of operational, but not thought through and ideological secular privilege. And so doing a report, which I did for Cabinet Minister, the Minister of Education, Chris Hipkins, the then Minister of Education, Chris Hipkins, was revealing to look at this history and to write it up for them, as it were. But also that once again, it's still a contentious issue. And so they didn't want to change the 64 Act. That new legislation is always problematic. So there's still a kind of minority vested interest, which has all sorts of unhealthy complexions in Christian formation in schools. It now has a kind of ethnic and racial dimension. But it's still broadly supported by the churches, not always for the right reasons, in my view. So I think that's exactly the thing. But we've the three demographic shifts, and then we probably should ask another question, is simply that the number of Christians didn't convert, they just got old and died and didn't replace themselves generationally. And I call that the half-life of Christianity. Well, no, it continues, but with less and less impact. And students that, I taught, and the survey we did about religious education was just amazing in that there are increasing numbers of people who are 2 and 3 generations removed from any religious formation. And so in that sense, I mean, it's the half-life continuing. But you can't make very safe assumptions. I mean, religion has been a minority affair for 20 years now, and increasingly so. The second issue that seems, significant is simply that Christianity has changed. The ethnicization of Christianity has been dramatic. And so the traditions are changing, and it's no longer a Pākehā and Māori affair, unless you go to parts of the north. There aren't large other religious groups. But so the issue there is that the Christianity has changed, and its traditions have changed. It's no longer coincides with the Christian Pākehā privilege. And the third change is that there have been about, 10% of the population are non-Christian, and have, like migrants, have come from all religious parts of the world and brought traditions here. And part of what's going on at Vic is also the massive defection from Christianity by Māori. I have moved, and you get this every day. I did a podcast recently with a woman who's responsible in the health service for biculturalism, and who sent me a link to a book she's compiled called Non-Christian Karakia Waiata, which is for health service use. And you want to say she's Christian by background, but you want to say why, but then she's in her 50s. She'll probably think I'm being rude, but I don't know how old she is. Okay. Maybe 50. But there's a call in the health service by her team, but also by others, to distance, I don't know, Tāwairua from its Christian links, disengagement or something. And so all that bears very heavily on the loss of Christian privilege and the replacement by something which is generally just not religiously informed and doesn't grasp religious significance. Yeah.
That's actually perfect for the follow-up question
I had. A follow-up question.
So what does secular privilege in Aotearoa mean for the project of religious diversity?
Religious diversity, as I define it, but if you're playing with it, you're allowed to. People don't always understand this, not even the board members of the Religious Diversity Centre. We had the AGM Sunday before last in Auckland. One of the issues raised by one of the staff, who is lovely but much younger, was how are we going to get through to the people who aren't part of we have a religious leaders forum, and you have the senior Catholics and the Anglican, we had two archbishops, and there's the worthies of the religious traditions, which is fine. But this younger board member just said, well, how are we going to get to the people I come across in my generation who don't have those affiliations? They're not bound by, they're eclectic, they're not opposed to religion, they just don't have much experience, but they often delve or are interested in spiritual dimensions of life, etc., etc. And my view is a very, very simple one, is that part of the measurement, the metrics of religious diversity are those who come from families which are no longer religious. And so no religion is part of religious diversity. And for me, this is very simple, both historically but conceptually. We're only beginning to understand, how to research the non-affiliated, the non-institutionalized religious people. And we don't do it very well because we make gratuitous assumptions. We had the head of the nationalist and humanist who came at the last meeting and said, I'm here representing 2 million New Zealanders. Well, my response to the time was, that's like saying I'm part of 5 million New Zealanders who don't play chess. Well, yes, you are, but it isn't the community. And so the value of focusing on religious communities is you can find them. And whereas the rationalists and humanists are very in their hundreds and in terms of membership, and don't often represent, many of them have a more radical atheist agenda, an anti-religious agenda. Whereas for the vast majority of people, that certainly is probably less evident. We haven't studied enough. So in that sense, I think that the non-religious are part of our picture of religious diversity. In terms of secular privilege, it means that it's quite difficult to get religious items on the agenda. And maybe this is the place to talk a little bit more about the role of religious study. But what it means in practice is that an example of secular privilege. I went to a meeting, you have to be very careful, with senior government officials and politicians, which was with religious communities. And one of the issues raised there was by a religious leader of a particular community. And he wanted to raise with the government officials and the politicians that the high schools in Wellington, which included members of his minority community, the schools had participated in Rainbow Week. And he was very upset about this, and he tried to get other religious communities to join him. Rather late in the day, because it was after Rainbow Week, but to say this is a problem for us, we find this very problematic and difficult, and it runs counter to our understanding of our religious traditions. Real religious diversity issue. And the government official who was responsible for this is a very senior person in a ministry and knowledgeable. And just said, look, I'm really, really sorry to hear about this, but, these things take time, but they won't define, and your children and grandchildren won't find this problematic. Now, this is the opposite of diversity. This is secular privilege. Now, it might actually be true, because we've had generations of migrants who come with traditions that now are in the non-religious sector. We've had a secularizing position, and that's just how it works. But to assume that is the case infuriated this particular person, because what he said was, "You're not listening to me." And we say, oh, yes, our liberal perspective, I take your religion totally seriously. I respect it, etc., etc. But then I don't, and that's secular privilege. And so the impact on religious diversity is that people aren't stupid. You are not listening to me was the truth. Even if the generational truth might be, who knows what the future will hold. So the impact on it is it undermines the claims. Now, religious diversity is very problematic in itself because it has a kind of descriptive sense. There are lots of different religious traditions, but it also has a normative sense, which is not part of the Religious Diversity Centre, but certainly part of the interfaith world, which is that diversity is a good. I mean, we celebrate diversity. And in order to celebrate diversity, we often can't have those difficult conversations. Because I respect you doesn't mean it means I respect you so much we won't talk about Rainbow Week. Whereas you want to, but I respect you so much you can't. So, but it's really tricky. I mean, there was another recent issue on one of the committees I'm on in Wellington, which was about proselytization in the lunchtime at a state college that's very close to it, which won't be named, in which there were complaints, and the Board of Trustees made a decision, and the person, again from a minority community, a different community, couldn't understand why aren't we allowed to promote our truth? And the technical reason was very simple, because the Board of Deputies and the principal said no. But the rationale behind it is the inconsistency of the blurring between the demographics of religious diversity, the descriptive, and the kind of normative approach. And so often we fudge the real issues. We haven't had the scope for the kind of theological issues. And one of the questions I read this morning was, religious diversity and Christians, and part of it is you can have these difficult decisions. We have something that I'm on, it's called the Abrahamic Council, which is Muslim, Christians, and Jews, and we do have difficult conversations. But a few meetings ago, we decided perhaps we're talking about Gaza and the Middle East, and we go, no, it's probably a good idea that we stop the meeting now, we all go home. Before, there are limits to difficult conversations.
Some conversations are too difficult.
Well, they can't all be had at once.
No.
And the awful truth is that my truth can offend you. We all think, if I just speak my truth and you speak your truth, we can all speak truth, and everything will be, you accept my truth and I accept. But the truth is that my truth can hurt you. And your truth can hurt me. And so, but you have to initiate these conversations, but that they can't be done in the interfaith space, but they also can't be done, and in a curious way, the interfaith space, which is about encounter, a kind of Buberian agenda, we meet you and we like you. And having done quite a lot of interfaith, people are lovely.
Yeah.
And they're nice to have a cup of tea with. And I call it the hermeneutics of the warm tummy. Because you feel really good, and I feel, oh, well, I like you, know. But actually, none of the difficult issues, we do need to have rainbow discussions, we do need to have political discussions, we do need to have these discussions. And otherwise, we're really disturbed. And this government official was really disturbed, another government official, another meeting, when a member of a particular community thought that polygamy would be of benefit to New Zealand. Something that not everyone in the room thought was a good idea. But we don't have these conversations. And that's kind of lethal. And it might be an area, but it isn't. I'm segueing to religious studies.
Do it,
Ninian Smart's view of religious studies was that there was this phenomenology, there was this space created between the kind of cognitive content of religion, the claims, and description. And it's kind of beautifully naive. I used it last in 2019 in a UNESCO conference in Jerusalem. The holy sites are all contested. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is built on top of the Temple Mount. This is this and that, and people keep building on top of the first Christian, the first churches in Rome were built on top of pagan temples. You know, even pagan gives the game away. Older religious sites, and this is just the nature of unfolding religious history. You know? But it raises real difficulties, and one of the things I argued was that with scholars of the holy sites. I got, because I was quoting, to have the first word of the conference, but not the last, which is a limited advantage because things go off in all sorts of different ways. But my line, the conference proceedings you can follow up on, I'll send you a link if you need it. But the line I took was that there were, not everything, you can't agree on history, but you can agree on quite a lot of it. This took place then, this took place then, and we measure the years differently and we call it something else. But certain events, and where we can't is really important because we need to create, and it's only when we've got a shared history we can begin to look at different interpretations. And some of them collapse. I had a row with a Muslim scholar there who was saying, but, where the temple wall is, you have no right to that. And when I was in Istanbul a few years ago, there's Suleiman the Great wrote this thing, which I can't read it in Turkish, but I did read it in translation, in which he gives the western wall of the temple in perpetuity to the Jews of Jerusalem. So, and he said, oh, I don't think that's true. And I said, well, actually, and I had to get a copy of the document. See, that's why the World Wide Web is wonderful. Share it. And it just did happen. Now, he might not have had the authority to do it. And some people don't agree with the caliphate, but there is a fact. And when we're dealing with our own colonial history, there are facts. Increasingly, there are mutual fantasies, like there were at this conference, and so the mutual fantasies are very problematic. But we should take history seriously, and history isn't just a kind of orientation. But actually, things did take place. They're sometimes understood differently, but you can have kind of eggs in the sand to do a bit of surveying, dangerous surveying. And then, there is the beginnings of conversation. Where, you're still going to have disputes, but you can have them within boundaries. And that's the argument. The difficulty with the change in religious studies is that phenomenology has been dropped. The idea that you could create this space, kind of before judgment, has kind of collapsed, and religious studies has had a terrible kind of dilemma, which is it's had to prove itself because of secular privilege uphill that it's relevant, and it does this often really badly. So much religious studies published in the last 30 years has just been contributions to theory with a capital T. Intersectional religion is dominant now. And so, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be. I might want to say something about that in just a moment. But in terms of religious studies, the difficulty becomes that you don't have anything new to add. But religious studies tends to prove what's already being demonstrated everywhere. And so quite a lot of the work on racial and climate change is either just confirmatory and affirmatory of what everyone else is doing without religion. So you think, oh, wow. Sorry, that's one of the projects I'm involved with the people. But that's not, and it's beneficial because it's about mobilizing religion, but not about adding anything. And so the difficulty, you either say, oh, well, no, look, religion is the opposite. And the opposite already exists as part of the dominant ideology. And so you end up saying, oh, look, I don't know, the dominant ideology is about individualism and possessiveness and this and the other. And oh, look, religion's about community. And it's just a mirror image. And you've gained nothing. And we do this all the time. And the Smartian vision was there might be something. And it also lives in the metaphors, in the language, in the poetry, in the praxis of religion, which actually challenges dominant views as opposed to affirms them or denies them in any absolute way. And an awful lot of religious studies has fallen into the spiritual antithesis in the crudest way. We can show that we've got something to say because it's an opposite, but then, this just affirms, the dominant way, or we just affirm it. And so in the areas I know a little bit about, an awful lot of religious studies, and it does it to a high degree, and it does it well. Daniel Byron's work on Judaism is kind of exhilarating to read, but it's Judith Butler and contemporary theory. And there's nothing wrong with that, except Judaism doesnn't seem to add very much, and you don't need it to get where you get to, except it mobilizes and energizes a tradition. And an awful lot of stuff seems to me to fit into that way. So to give it a kind of intellectual biographical way, when I started as a graduate student, we were still bound by, that's how old I am, the legacy of the Cold War, which is religion prospered, religious studies and departments prospered in the United States and Canada because religion was the bastion of anti-communism. We're not atheists, we're religious, and that's a mark of our difference. And the critique when I was a graduate student was devastating. When I was doing my MA, the beginnings of what became the collapse or challenge to the grand narrative. And so it wasn't easy to be a Marxist or a neo-Marxist or to be a liberal because these were just grand stories. And it's the beginning of intersectionality, although it goes in a different way. And people make on the grand narratives. Daniel Boyan wrote a book about fat rabbis. It could be fat priests, but somebody makes on the deal. And so the grand narratives, collapsed. And they collapsed under the weight of something which was seen to be liberating you from the grand narrative. And what was going to liberate you was deconstructionism, which I bought into in a very, very big way, which was wildly exciting. And it was wildly exciting because it kept showing the other even in what seemed to be the same. And it kept saying life is really complicated. And unlike some of the lesser Foucaultian legacy, power is complicated. And power in terms of resistance, power in terms of things. But the issue that eventually made everyone tired 15 years later, a kind of Derridean fatigue, was simply that Derrida advocated endless analysis and what he called, and it was for him a sacred thing, deferral. All action is premature. And so thinking is eternal. And finally, it's wearisome because you can't do anything, you know. And you end up saying, like Foucault, who was visited prisons very endlessly, but said there isn't any theory of reform, and so you could just get tired. And but a brilliant tiredness. But what replaced it was a legal theory grew in with Wendy Brown and with Judith Butler into an ideology, and the ideology. A bit like where I started with Lloyd as a very young student was it's amazingly empowering. In 12 weeks, you can get a theory of everything. And the theory is back to a much simpler notion of power. And you deconstruct power only to come to the same conclusions, which is very undeconstructionist and un-Derridean. But what you discover, is that all ideologies mask power. And power is actually not complex, but is patriarchal, misogynistic, colonial. And all of these are intersectional. Just as the victims are intersectional, so the power is intersectional. And so you end up having truths that are very problematic. So at the counter-terrorism conference I went to, it's the last one with DPMC, a professor of psychology from Auckland, who was very sensible, saying, there is no difference between patriarchy and terrorism. Well, in an intersectional way, that's absolutely true, except you need to understand them discreetly and distinctly, and you need to do some disaggregation. Now, you don't want to do disaggregation that leads to endless deferral because they're meta. But what the crisis of intersectionality has led to a huge desire to overcome, this is my view, overcome deferral with activism. And so the words that arose out of intersectionality, are committed, are authentic, are activist. And these are really significant. And so what you get is endless action. And activism is really important if it fosters thinking, but also fosters some sort of change. The horror of intersectional power is that there isn't a cumulative address. There's only some mad platonic future where the great and the good and the true and all the contradictions, Plato says, in the one, they're all going to be resolved. Well, in our final liberation, and its deeply theological position, all of these contradictions will be resolved. In the meantime, there is a kind of activism that sometimes is very well-directed, sometimes isn't. And you get at the RDC's climate group, we had a huge row between should the efforts go into, if it's true that the G7 countries produce 80% of our lethal man-made climate condition, should our efforts go into focusing all our energies on getting the G7 to make some dramatic shift versus the ground up routes, they're not really alternatives, but we don't really have time for the routes without this. And so activism in itself can be misdirected. It's very important that I'm a part of a group which is calling for a ceasefire. It's important we have a ceasefire, but if we have no mechanism for affecting a ceasefire, then it's just activism. And that has its role, and I helped write a statement about this, and there's all good stuff. We had a press release, and it got this much, But the truth is, without process and without politics, activism is only activism. And the difficulty is it doesn't allow you to move forward understanding the complexities. So what am I reading about this? The danger with activism is localism, is that we see everything as local and we don't join the dots. What goes on in Aotearoa, wonderfully liberating for me. I mean, reflects things differently, of course, but that are happening elsewhere. We have very much our own perspectives and our own distinctive patterns, but we need to understand them in relation to others. We have to, because the conceptual apparatus we use and the language we use, from indigeneity to neoliberalism, I mean, is shared with different perspectives. So in that sense, I mean, it's vital that we do understand. My two current projects, one is religious literacy, and we're doing our survey. We've got a date now, which is
exciting.
A step forward, and some students.
Cool.
But it's not just religious literacy, which you wrote about, and it's religious literacy and competency. And the significance of that simply is people, there is kind of 20 questions on religion you might know, and 20 questions you might know on the role that religion plays in society. And that's religious literacy. But religious competency comes out of cultural competency, and Aotearoa has a particular history on that front of bicultural competencies, which we've been quite good at. Well, we've been good at raising awareness and raising issues. And religious competency is basically how not to commit boo-boos with people of other religions. So I went to a meeting given by someone who should buy a very senior academic, Masawana, who had Jewish guests and prawns for supper. Well, it's a kind of no-no. Having New Zealand Pinot Noir is a very wonderful thing, unless you have guests whose religions tell them, unless there are Mormons and Muslims coming. There are dietary restrictions, there are temporal restrictions on holy times when we're not to have meetings, there are dress codes, behaviour codes, contact codes, etc., etc. And so religious competency is basically learning about that sort of diversity, but also about its ideological competency, telling somebody that they'll get rainbowism in 2 generations' time is a failure of religious competence. And so cultural competency and religion. So that's the two parts. My other project, and I've just sent something off, which a version of something I did for UNESCO, is where I should end probably, but is about cosmopolitanism. And what I'm very concerned about is cosmopolitanism. You know what it is? I mean, part of the ancient world revived by Kant and had a Kantian version of cosmopolitanism in the 19th century. And essentially it's that we have our own identity and our own group as part of larger wholes, which aspirationally are universal. But in practice, it's much more limited. And cosmopolitan is that I've invented for this paper a term called cosmopiety. And cosmopiety is cosmopolitan piety. It's basically the religious dimension of cosmopolitanism, which was always there. But religions have been very, very good at crossing ethnic, racial, and boundary lines in all sorts of ways historically. And there is a kind of implicit cosmopolitanism. So the big question becomes how you recover the intersectional critique of cosmopolitanism is simply that it's elitist and masks power. And so in that way, we should dump it very quickly. There is a kind of nationalist critique which says, oh yes, you can't have nationalism alongside cosmopolitanism. There is a kind of debate we're having between New Zealand, between populism and globalism, etc. And these all run into this, as do all of our debates. And so the issue is how you maintain a kind of universalism in an era of hyperlocalism. And it's a tricky one. The book I'm reading at the moment is by the New School. It's called Radical Universalism, which attempts, not totally successfully, to say that he wants to be a universalist, but also very local. He's a philosopher. He's famous for a book on Spinoza and Kant, which is a thesis I don't buy, but it's a PhD at Yale, that the Kantian legacy draws much more heavily on Spinoza. And then he wrote a really sophisticated account of the story of Isaac. What in Hebrew is called Akedah, the binding of Isaac, but in Christianity became the sacrifice of Isaac. Of course, he isn't sacrificed, that's the point. But he wrote a thing on the sacrifice of Isaac, but a kind of philosophical debate of the limits of ethics. And then he wrote another book on Haifa, on not a two-state solution, but a one-state solution, but a radically democratic one. And which, when I read it a few years ago, seemed completely out to lunch, but given everything, seems to be, we should read it again. So no, but he's a new schooler, and this ongoing thing, we've had a kind of collapse of human rights because of the universalism, because they supposedly speak of white privilege. Because so it's trying. My Cosmopolitan project is trying to recover something of the broader view at the same time as recognizing that it isn't opposed to the local, but that we need broader perspectives. We're radically losing them. So hope. I went to my bookshelf this morning and I thought I'd recommend a book for you to read if you haven't read it. The best thing I've read on hope recently is by Terry Eagleton. Do you know Terry Eagleton?
Yes, of course.
I love him. He was a professor at Lancaster, and I've been in the same room with him. I was just saying I met him, but there were 300 people there. And I did say hello. One of the people who taught him the studies at Lancaster, Adrian Cunningham, and Terry Eagleton were the founders of Slant, the radical Catholic magazine, when they were undergraduates at Cambridge. And they were young Catholics who grew up in Irish Catholic families who couldn't be culturally anything else, but discovered Marxism. And Slant was a radical Catholic journal, but it was much more Marxist than Catholic. And Adrian Cunningham spent his lifetime, very strangely, as a Marxist, wrote about Marx, and his last book was on Catholics and Jung. And so he made a strange transition towards, I hate Jung, sorry, it's like wading in golden syrup. I write notes saying this means this and then it doesn't. I never get it, but people do in big. Adrian was a friend and colleague, and he got Jung in a big way. But what I was going to say was Terry Eagleton, who I've always learned such a lot, but is intensely Christian. You should read Radical Sacrifice. Radical Sacrifice is it's the resurrectionist hope. So and as a Jew, this doesn't fully resonate. I appreciate, but don't resonate. But the Hope book is called Hope Without Optimism, and it's rather lovely. It's a few years ago, 2016, 15, 16, when I read it, and it's on my bookshelf because I saw it this morning. What he argues very forcefully in the introductory chapter is very, very simply that optimism and pessimism are two sides of the same coin, and they're idiotic. Having, I don't know, looking on the bright side of life, as Monty Python has it, is idiotic if the facts don't reveal that. And pessimism, he thinks, is equally stupid because they both deny the facts. And he will say that the important thing about hope is you need a rationale, and for him, a rational background to be hopeful. Otherwise, it's just optimism, which is empty. And that seemed like a good place to start. Jews are obsessed by hope. The national anthem of Israel is called Hatikva, the hope. The obsession is lots of minority people are really good at hope, except for the one that disappears. But I think Jews are, with some good reason, they're convinced of not the why, but the certainty of continuity, which is a hope. And religions are all hopeful. I mean, and critiques of religion, Spinoza and Nietzsche, are pessimistic. Whereas, I think, you can't have a religion that doesn't have some positive hope. And the history of religions is the data for hope. Now, Jews have a rather different take than Christians do about hope. in that Jews argue, if you know your Old Testament, the argument from the past, it's all about emunah, faithfulness, and faith and hope. And Jews understand faith in the past is the only thing that gives you faith in the future, whereas Christians, one strand of interpretation of the Gospels is that a Christian hope and faith, I mean, hope was a virtue, but was a mysterious virtue. Jews always say we begin our prayers we're in our holy month before the new year, where we're doing our penitence. I've got to bring up my cousin and say, I'm sorry I was so rude to you, you have to pay your debts back. You get rid of all the nonsense before you do that. But emunah, faith, which came to be pistis in Greek, and came to be a pious hope in the sense, almost in the optimistic sense, a faith that would all come out in the wash, which Nietzsche found so offensive. The Jewish view is the prayers for us, that we're saying at the moment, say, for you brought us out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, the house of slavery. And so we say, you've already redeemed us. We know it's a fact because we wouldn't be here if you hadn't. And therefore, we can have hope. And so we're very empirical about our hope, you know. If it hadn't already happened, we might have bigger difficulty. So, and it's kind of, you know, I don't know, it's like an Alan Badiou definition of love. He says love is something that can only be known once it's taken place, and the hope is it can happen again. And which is, you know, anyway. So it's a kind of empirical base to change. But the one thing I was going to say, and when I was walking down here, the thing which I think is wrong, I was going to say that young people seem to be open in different ways, and giving you my intellectuals, so you can see it's been a series of promised liberations that never quite deliver. But so your hope. But then I thought of that horrible person I dislike intensely, Greta Thunberg, who I can't remember the quote, but it's from that book. And so I bought my niece the copy of the book that she was doing at school, and so it's only that I resented paying for it. It only had one idea, but she does say that when older people like me say, look, I have hope in the future because of the youth, she says, how dare you? And the notion simply is that, you know, we'll just leave it all to you to sort out. And I'm mindful, I don't like her, but I think that's quite a good insight. But I genuinely do think that new approaches, every era has its orthodoxy, and the only hope are those who break out of it.
There's a beautiful one line.
But it's so true.
Oh my goodness.
And beware of forced liberation.
Okay. How much I need to ask, how much time do you have? When do you need to leave?
I should have gone 20 minutes ago.
Oh, no, okay.
Okay, what were you going to say?
Well, I wanted to ask more about the religious studies and the role of religious studies, but I do, if we're out of time, then we're out of time.
A last thought on that. Simply, what was amazing learning Sanskrit for, I'm going to say, was reading stuff in different language. If you read the Bible in Hebrew, it's very different from reading it in English. The metaphors are different, the language is different. And the valuable thing about studying religion and studying other traditions is they are prismatic. This is a universalist claim, but prismatic takes on being human. And we are human. And being human means being embodied in a particular tradition, means having, for my case, a Jewish mother and father, Jewish grandparents, and growing up within a community that had its own norms and behaviours. You don't get to choose that. And you don't really get to choose it even if you reject it, because the rejection is a choice. But we're all embodied in different ways. And increasingly, like doing Philip's 352 class the other day, we talked about identity. And it was amazing to ask the students about their identity, in that they are very different from my experience, which was growing up in a particular community. Now, being a minority community means you always have to engage with others, but I had a very strong sense of who I was, that I didn't have to do anything I didn't have to develop an identity. It happened. And it's 8 days old. I was 6 days, and I wasn't asked whether. Formation doesn't work like that. And it also is difficult to delay. And we've got some friends who are saying, "Oh well, they're secular privilege." I say, well, we're going to let the children decide when they're 18 what religion they want. Well, that passed a few years ago, and they're brilliant secularists. It's not a choice.
No.
You can't you can't retrofit formation in a community. Now, you can, in a strange way, you can become Maori later on. You can claim a Iwi, you can claim to be an Ashkenazi Jew. You can develop an identity, and all sorts of people do. But it's very different from formation, and we need to recognise the different dynamics. It doesn't mean it's less strong or less authentic, but it's different. So in that sense, many of the young people in 352, for argument's sake, have incredibly convoluted identities. Someone is both Sunni and Shia. Someone is Maori and Irish. Someone isn't what they thought they were. One person listed so many identities. A 16th Norwegian, 16th, lovely young person. But their identity was a kind of proportion. Two other people spoke about Ancestry.com, as a way of thinking about your identity. Not very helpfully, but yes. But so what I'm trying to say about religious studies is that it's in a funny position. When I learned religious studies, Ninian wrote a book with different dimensions, but the dimensions intersect with the community, their ways of thinking about historic traditions. And whether it was the famous 5 or the secret 7, that's how I think of it.
It's so good. It's so good.
But it didn't matter. You can enumerate those. But there was a list. And you always had in all the introductory books a thing at the end about the contemporary. But the truth is that people's identities, there's a focus on identity in an era of intersectional constructivism where having identity is a demand. And one person said, well, I'm not quite sure who I am, as if this was somehow a deficit. You're you. And it's empirically the case, but there's a kind of demand for identity, which for some, at least this one, is an awful pressure. I've got to honour this and do this and celebrate that, and God forbid, it's a tricky one. So in some ways, religious studies has had to change. And the way in which Smart did it was you had to study one major and one minor tradition. You had to do a language within the tradition. So you had to embed yourself in those metaphors, in those practices, in the language, etc., etc. And people, if you did a PhD, you had to do a major and a minor tradition. And so it meant, so you focused on something, had the language, some language expertise, but you also were expected to understand your project in relation to a tradition. And at the same time, you had a kind of second fiddle to your bow. That's because they produced a lot of lecturers and teachers. So it was an enhancing factor, but it also gave you a kind of counterweight. And so you had some experience. Now, traditions, when I came to take the chair up, going back to Vic in 1894, I reorganised it and changed it from world religions because of the Secret Seven, the famous one. And because it wasn't very clear what they were, and they were done by numerics largely rather than history. And not all traditions are the same value as their number, but and made it more into, and changed the name to religious studies. It's changed again.
Study of religion now.
And now it's religion in the singular, whereas religions were in the plural. And part of that's the reflection that you don't do traditions anymore. And so the model in 94 was first year introduction, East and West. But we did away with the East and West a couple of years later and looked at kind of religion in Aotearoa and a broader religion politics, 7. Second year, you specialised in 2 or more traditions. Third year, you did themes that ran cross-traditionally. This worked very well, but it also reflected a demographic where people came out of traditions even if they weren't actively involved in them.
Yeah.
We now live in a world where, like our younger employee at RDC says, where they don't fit into any of these categories, but they're still interested.
Yeah.
And existentially as well as intellectually interested. But so the tension for religious studies now is to reflect that in a way that's not easy. And so much still comes out of traditions. And in Aotearoa comes out particularly of Christianity. I mean, one of the unspoken things that will take us 20 years to get is that so much contemporary tikanga is actually Christian. And that doesn't mean it is Christian because it's been appropriated, assimilated, reworked, re-owned, and re-engaged with older traditions. But we've spent 200 years dismantling and analysing Christianity in this way. But to do it to ourselves is very... So religious studies is in a very tricky position because it doesn't have its constituent audience. Lloyd's audience, and they were big classes, were largely people who'd been to Sunday school, had gone to church, and finally escaped from their home. And nobody knew if they did or not. But and his were very directive. I still see him every second Wednesday. He's 100. He doesn't read anymore. I read to him. You have to tell Philip the article on Scottish diaries for settlers that he gave me to read.
Yes.
Presbyterian diaries. Yeah. I read half of Lloyd last Wednesday. And he said he recognised half these people from when he was a minister in the 50s. In Rangiora. So, but no, what I was going to... Lloyd had a view. He said he took you by the hand and he said, look, I know you've been to Sunday school and your natural view at the moment, I'm going to take you for a walk in the garden. And I'm going to take you away from city Christianity, the old man in the sky. I'm going to take you away from magic tricks. That was his view of resurrection, and if you just hold my hand tightly, you'll come out of it, the other end, which I did 3 years later, and you'll realise that faith is important. There was a bit of a trick there because he owned secular modernity as well as being really Christian. These were his shelling moments. He liked shelling. I don't know if you know. They were, there was a kind of Petrine view of the church, and then there was a Johannine view of the... No. Then there was a Pauline view, which was Protestantism, Catholicism, and then we finally have the Johannine view, which is the world we live in. Which is a progression from Protestantism. But he took your hand, and so you got to the end, and he said, well, you really don't, you're now a liberal Christian and a modernist, and you don't need to go to church, and you can have the tradition. That was always a Christian strategy, and religious studies doesn't know where to go now. And the more relevant it becomes without having anything theoretically to add to theory, the greater the danger is that it's like so many of I still read lots of books about religious studies, and they add very... I just read one about religions and literacy, and it's a really interesting study, except the point is that you need cultural communities for literacy, and some of them are religious, but the religious literacy doesn't add anything to our understanding of literacy except for the sociological formation. And so the insight is sociological without any real religious, except religious sociology. And so there's a great danger in religious studies that, having lost traditional wisdom, as in the traditions, recreating it has to be done in a much more skillful way. And you don't have the empirical base to do it. I mean, you can't define the communities. I mean, if the community, like our young person at RDC, if it's she says, I said, who are you talking about? She said, I'm talking about people of my generation, okay, people of my generation in South Auckland, in Aotearoa, in the Globe, in the West. I mean, who are they? And they don't have a demographic, which makes them impossible to study. And so what we end up with is hyperlocalism at the other end, where you study 3 people or 7 people in southern Auckland. And it's not that it's not worthy of study, but it's the cart before the horse. There's no demographic or cultural base out of which that can work. And it's a part of creating it, but kind of not in a recognizable way. And so every study becomes amazingly significant in itself, but bridging it back to broader things, which aren't just affirmations of the current state of affairs, is really hard. And requires a greater dexterity. But if all you've got to say is religion is climate change, religion is a whole lot of things that are incredibly significant to us, you're saying nothing. If you say religion, oh, it's really wonderful, religious communities are the opposite, the received wisdom, and the antidote, it's equally silly. What we need to do is be able to recover the languages, the life forms, the richness of traditions as they've mutated in an unprecedented fashion. And a world beyond tradition. I wrote an article called "Have you Community Beyond Tradition"?
No.
Okay, an article that somebody wrote a thesis on. No, I mean, they did a whole lot of empirical work that I hadn't done, but no, they really did.
Wow.
And it was a project taken up from the article by Paul Rosner at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And Adam Cohen, who's now teaching at Tulane, did his thesis using that as a framework.
Oh, yeah, that would be so interesting.
But no, the idea is what happens, and it was written a long time ago, and I was very worried then about exactly the same. But what happens when religion moves out of communities?
Yeah.
And we don't know.
No.
And we're flailing at the moment. I mean, not I don't mean locally. I just meant globally, religious studies. And religious studies has been a victim of the Cold War, the end of it, in the departments of lockdown. And the worst thing for religion is the contemporary type, the framework of theory, in that religion just becomes one mode of power to one. Religion becomes one form of colonized misogyny. And of course it's true, but it's just not very interesting, and it's not very nuanced, and it's not very, it doesn't have much to tell us, whereas the only interesting thing is the ways in which it isn't, without it not being false. Anyway, that's what I was going to say. I'm going.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It's very old now, but read Community.
Yeah. No,
so I'll send you a reference.
No, because
we'll
I
have
just
to
completed my thesis. It's finally in the library.
Brilliant.
So good.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But that would have been a great thing to read for it. So, retrospect,
Oh, look, it's years ago. And it was an attempt to formulate the issue, not answer it.
Yeah, because I did reference you at one point. It was an interesting piece about, I think, spirituality in New Zealand. I can't remember what it was, but I remember you talking about, I asked my students and they don't know who they are or what they identify as, and I was like, I'm one of those students.
But it's really changed.
Yeah,
the
it has.
352 students,
They're fantastic.
They really are, but they, they have completely, nobody has a primary religious identity.
No.
Religion used to be a way of cutting across ethnicities. And the horror is the radical departure. I mean, if you read Paul seriously, if you read your Galatians, the Christianity was the response and the answer to ethnos and the divisions of ethnos. And one in Christ meant something. I never quite understood what not man, not woman meant, but I did say, not barbarian or Jew, not Greek nor Jew. And yet I raised that with an Auckland seminar earlier this year with the Professor of Maori Theology from Otago, and saying, look, have you given up Paul? And he said, on this point, yes. I mean, he was saying that, in fact, the ethnic dimension of my Christian faith is at the heart of its spirituality.
Yeah.
And I can understand how you might say that as a Maori, but it's a huge and radical departure from the Christian tradition. And that is factually so. He said it. And it's consistent with what I read of him. But that means, again, it's a community beyond tradition. And it's no longer Christian in some sense, but of course it is. But it's departure.
So interesting.
Anyway, good luck with your podcast.
Thank you so much for that.
Edit it down.
Oh, we love it.